The story of Epicurus begins not in a quiet garden, but in the restless aftermath of Alexander the Great's empire, a world where the old city-states of Greece had been torn apart by ambition, war, and the sudden vacuum left by a conqueror who died without an heir. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his vast territories fractured into the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Antigonids, each ruled by generals who now called themselves kings. In the Greek heartland, especially in the bustling port of Athens, the political climate grew increasingly unstable. The city's democratic institutions, once the pride of the classical era, were now under constant threat from oligarchic coups and the heavy hand of Macedonian garrisons. Citizens found themselves caught between the desire for personal security and the fear that the grand ambitions of empire would swallow their private lives whole. It was within this climate of uncertainty that a new kind of philosophical school began to take shape. The Lyceum, founded by Aristotle a century earlier, had already shown that a community of scholars could gather around a common place of learning, a garden, a gymnasium, a lecture hall. Yet the Lyceum was increasingly seen as an institution tied to the aristocratic elite, a place where the pursuit of knowledge was often entangled with political patronage. Young men who felt alienated by the grandiose rhetoric of the Stoics and the cynicism of the skeptics began to look for a philosophy that addressed the everyday anxieties of living under constant threat. They wanted not only to understand the world, but to find a way to live peacefully within it. Enter Epicurus, born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, a place famed for its poets and its mercantile vigor. He moved to Athens as a young man, drawn by the city's reputation as a hub of intellectual exchange. There, he studied under the atomist teachings of Democritus, whose bold claim that everything in the universe is composed of indivisible particles moving through the void offered a radical, materialist explanation of nature. Epicurus was also influenced by Aristippus of Cyrene, the founder of the Cyrenaic school, who taught that pleasure was the ultimate good, though Aristippus emphasized immediate, sensual gratification. From Democritus, Epicurus took the idea that the universe operates without divine interference. From Aristippus, he borrowed the centrality of pleasure, but he would soon transform both into a nuanced, measured doctrine. Around 306 BCE, after years of wandering, teaching, and refining his ideas, Epicurus established his own school, famously known as the Garden. He chose a modest plot of land on the outskirts of Athens, near the gate of the city, a place where olive trees whispered in the wind and the scent of thyme rose from the earth. The garden was not a grand marble complex, but a simple courtyard surrounded by low walls, a place where the sound of birdsong could be heard over the clamor of the city. In this setting, Epicurus gathered a small, intimate group of disciples, the most prominent of whom were his close friends Metrodorus and Hermarchus. Metrodorus, who had been a fellow student in the early days, became Epicurus's most trusted confidant, a man whose quick mind and generous spirit embodied the very ideals of the school. Hermarchus, a former slave who had earned his freedom through his intellectual contributions, served as a living testament to the garden's radical inclusivity. In Epicurus's community, status and birth mattered far less than the capacity to pursue a tranquil life. The garden operated on principles that were both practical and philosophical. First, meals were shared. Every evening the members would gather around a simple wooden table, a modest spread of barley bread, olives, figs, and a modest amount of wine. The act of eating together was more than sustenance. It was a ritual of fellowship, a reminder that the pleasures of the table could be enjoyed without excess, that the company of friends amplified the joy of a simple bite. Epicurus himself would sit at the head of the table, not as a distant master, but as an equal participant, listening intently to the concerns of his companions. He believed that the communal sharing of food cultivated a sense of mutual security, reducing the fear of scarcity that plagued many Athenians in those turbulent times. Second, the garden hosted nightly discussions that stretched long into the night, illuminated by oil lamps and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the olive branches. These gatherings were structured yet informal. A topic would be introduced, perhaps the nature of the atoms, perhaps the proper way to evaluate desires, perhaps the role of the gods in human affairs, and then each participant would speak, challenge, and refine the argument. The discussions were not mere lectures, they were dialogues echoing the Socratic method but with a distinct flavor. Epicurus encouraged his students to question everything, even his own statements, because he believed that truth emerged from the careful weighing of ideas, not from the authority of a single voice. In these sessions, Metrodorus often played the role of the devil's advocate, pushing the conversation into uncomfortable territories, while Hermarchus would bring practical examples from daily life, grounding the abstract theories in lived experience. These two practices, shared meals and nightly dialogues, were more than pedagogical tools. They were the very embodiment of Epicurus's ethical project. He taught that the greatest source of human anxiety stemmed from fear. Fear of death, fear of the gods, fear of poverty, fear of social alienation. By creating a community where material needs were modestly met and intellectual needs were constantly nurtured, the garden offered a concrete antidote to those fears. In the garden's shade, a student could hear the gentle rustle of leaves and feel that the world was not a hostile arena, but a place where the mind could find peace. The influence of earlier atomists is evident in Epicurus's physics. He adopted Democritus's claim that everything consists of atoms moving through the void, but he added a crucial twist. Atoms possess the property of klinemen, a spontaneous, unpredictable swerve. This swerve, he argued, broke the deterministic chain of cause and effect, allowing for free will and for the emergence of novel events. In this way, Epicurus could explain how human beings could act voluntarily, why moral responsibility was meaningful, and why the gods, if they existed, were not meddling in human affairs. This materialist view was radical, for it denied the popular belief that the gods constantly intervened in mortal affairs, a belief that had long been used to justify political tyranny and social oppression. From Aristippus, Epicurus borrowed the centrality of pleasure, yet he transformed it into a doctrine of ataraxia, a tranquil state of mind free from disturbance. He distinguished between natural and necessary desires, such as the desire for food, shelter, and friendship, and vain, unnecessary desires like the endless pursuit of wealth, fame, or power. By focusing on the former and discarding the latter, Epicurus argued, one could achieve a lasting happiness that was not dependent on external circumstances. This was a profound departure from the Cyrenaic emphasis on immediate, sensual gratification. Epicurus's pleasure was not the fleeting rush of a feast, but the steady, untroubled calm that comes from knowing that one's basic needs are met and that one's mind is free from baseless anxieties. The political turbulence of the era provided fertile ground for these ideas to take root. As the Hellenistic kingdoms expanded, they imposed heavy taxes, demanded military service, and often interfered in the internal affairs of Greek city-states. Citizens grew wary of the promises of power and prestige offered by the ruling elites. In such a climate, the garden's emphasis on self-sufficiency and inner tranquility offered a compelling alternative. The community's modest lifestyle, simple meals, modest clothing, a small house, served as a living critique of the lavish extravagance of the courts of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties. Epicurus himself is said to have lived in a modest house with a garden of his own, tending to herbs and vines, preferring the scent of rosemary to the perfume of courtly banquets. This anecdote, recorded by later biographers, underscores his commitment to the very principles he taught. Yet, despite the apparent simplicity of his community, Epicurus faced serious accusations from his contemporaries. One of the most persistent claims was that he was merely a hedonist, a philosopher who taught that the highest good was pleasure, and therefore his teachings were tantamount to encouraging indulgence and moral laxity. Critics pointed to his famous statement that pleasure is the beginning and the end of the blessed life, and argued that this reduced ethics to a selfish pursuit of personal satisfaction. To address this, Epicurus offered a careful clarification. He distinguished between kinetic pleasures, those that arise from the removal of pain, and static pleasures, those that arise from a state of contentment. The highest pleasure, he argued, is the static pleasure of a tranquil mind, not the fleeting thrill of excess. He wrote in his letter to Menocius, "Pleasure is the absence of pain in the body and the absence of trouble in the soul." In this formulation, pleasure is not a license for decadence, but a description of a condition in which all unnecessary desires have been extinguished. The critique that Epicurus was a reckless hedonist therefore misses the subtlety of his ethical hierarchy. Another accusation was that the garden was a secretive cult, a closed group that operated under mysterious rites and perhaps even engaged in political subversion. This charge stemmed partly from the fact that the garden was a private space, where members could speak freely without fear of persecution. In an era when political dissent could be punished by exile or worse, such privacy was both necessary and suspicious. Moreover, the garden's members sometimes wore simple cloaks and used a distinctive emblem, a wreath of laurel, leading outsiders to suspect a quasi-religious identity. However, the primary sources, especially the testimonies of Diogenes Laertius and the surviving fragments of Epicurus's own letters, reveal that the garden was open to anyone who sought its teachings, regardless of social rank or wealth. The community was deliberately inclusive. Women, freed slaves, and even foreigners were welcomed, provided they were willing to adopt the lifestyle of moderation and inquiry. The secretive aspect was not about hidden doctrines, but about protecting a space where honest philosophical inquiry could occur without external interference. In this sense, the garden functioned more like a sanctuary than a cult, a place where the pursuit of wisdom was shielded from the political storms that raged beyond its walls. To further understand the distinctiveness of Epicurus's response to the era's upheavals, it is useful to compare his approach with that of his Stoic contemporaries. Zeno of Citium, who founded the Stoic school in the early 3rd century BCE, also reacted to the same social dislocation. Zeno taught that virtue, understood as living in accordance with nature, was the sole good and that external circumstances, wealth, health, even life itself, were indifferent. Cleanthes, Zeno's successor, famously composed the hymn to Zeus, portraying the universe as an ordered, rational whole governed by divine providence. For the Stoics, the proper response to political chaos was to cultivate an inner rationality that aligned with the cosmic logos, thereby achieving a kind of inner freedom that transcended external turmoil. Epicurus, by contrast, placed the source of tranquility not in rational alignment with a divine order, but in the empirical understanding that the gods do not interfere, and that death is simply the cessation of sensation. While both schools sought to free the individual from fear, the Stoics emphasized duty and the acceptance of fate, whereas Epicurus emphasized the removal of unnecessary desires and the cultivation of a modest, self-sufficient lifestyle. The two philosophies thus offer complementary, yet distinct pathways to the same goal, a life untroubled by the vicissitudes of the external world. A concrete illustration of the garden's communal learning can be seen in the practice of the Symposium of the Senses. Once a month, the members would bring a small assortment of foods, perhaps a handful of figs, a few olives, a slice of cheese, and engage in a guided sensory meditation. They would close their eyes, focus on the texture, the taste, the aroma, and then discuss how the experience contributed to a deeper appreciation of simple pleasures. This exercise was not about indulgence, but about training the mind to find contentment in modest sensory inputs, thereby reducing the craving for extravagant experiences. In another example, the garden organized what could be called philosophical walks. On clear evenings, the group would stroll through the olive groves surrounding the garden, each participant carrying a small lantern. Along the way, they would pause at particular trees or stones, each serving as a prompt for a philosophical reflection, perhaps on the nature of change, the constancy of the stars, or the fleeting nature of human ambition. These walks reinforced the idea that philosophy is not confined to the lecture hall. It is lived in the very act of moving through the world, observing and questioning. The anecdote of Metrodorus's sudden death offers a poignant glimpse into the garden's ethos. According to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, Metrodorus fell ill during a particularly harsh winter, and as his health waned, Epicurus and the other members gathered around his bedside, sharing a simple broth and reciting verses that celebrated the fleeting nature of life. In his final moments, Metrodorus reportedly said, "Do not mourn my passing, for the soul does not persist beyond the body, only the memory of our friendship endures." This moment encapsulated the Epicurean conviction that death is nothing to fear, because it is simply the cessation of sensation, and that the lasting legacy of a life is the impact on those who remain. The calm acceptance of mortality displayed by Metrodorus, and the communal support offered by his friends, became a teaching story that the garden repeated for generations. Hermarchus's journey from slavery to philosophical leadership also serves as a vivid illustration of the garden's radical inclusivity. Born into bondage, Hermarchus was purchased by a wealthy Athenian who recognized his sharp intellect and allowed him to study under Epicurus. When his master died, Hermarchus was granted his freedom, a rare occurrence in a society where manumission was often contingent upon extraordinary service. Yet Hermarchus did not simply return to the world of commerce. He chose to remain in the garden, contributing his insights on ethics and politics. His presence demonstrated that the community valued merit and wisdom over birthright, a stance that directly challenged the hierarchical norms of Hellenistic society. In a letter to an unknown correspondent, Hermarchus wrote, "The garden is not a place for the privileged alone. It is a field where the seed of reason may sprout in any soil." This sentiment resonated with many who felt disenfranchised by the dominant power structures of the time. The garden's influence extended beyond its immediate circle, shaping later philosophical thought in ways that are often underappreciated. The Roman poet Lucretius, writing a century after Epicurus's death, composed the epic poem De Rerum Natura, which systematically presented Epicurean physics, ethics, and cosmology to a broader audience. Lucretius's vivid descriptions of atoms whirling in the void, of the swerve that creates free will, and of the serene life achieved through the moderation of desires, all echo the teachings that were once debated under the olive trees of the garden. In turn, the Renaissance humanists rediscovered Lucretius, and through him, the legacy of Epicurus re-entered Western intellectual life, influencing thinkers such as Michel de Montaigne, who praised the Epicurean emphasis on the simple pleasures of life, and later the Enlightenment philosophers who championed a naturalistic worldview free from supernatural interference. Even in modern times, the spirit of the garden can be seen in contemporary movements that prioritize community, mindfulness, and sustainable living. Think of the co-housing projects that emphasize shared meals, collective decision-making, and ecological stewardship. These modern experiments echo Epicurus's belief that a supportive community, combined with a modest lifestyle, can greatly reduce the anxieties that arise from a competitive, consumer-driven society. Moreover, the growing field of positive psychology, with its focus on well-being, gratitude, and the cultivation of meaningful relationships, resonates with the Epicurean prescription of seeking static pleasures, those that arise from a tranquil mind rather than from fleeting external stimuli. To bring the narrative full circle, let us return to the image of the garden itself, a modest plot of land, a simple table, a circle of friends engaged in earnest conversation. In the midst of a world shaken by empire and upheaval, Epicurus offered a radical alternative, that the path to a good life does not require grandiose achievements or the favor of powerful patrons, but rather a careful examination of one's desires, a willingness to confront the fear of death, and the cultivation of a community where minds can meet openly. As Epicurus famously said, the wise man does not pursue the unattainable, but he seeks the attainable with a steady heart. The garden stands as a testament to that wisdom, a living laboratory where philosophy was not merely a set of abstract propositions, but a daily practice woven into the rhythm of meals, walks, and shared laughter. When we consider the criticisms leveled against Epicurus, whether he was a mere hedonist or a secretive cultist, we see that they arise from misunderstandings of his deeper project. The hedonist charge ignores his nuanced hierarchy of pleasures, which places tranquility above indulgence. The cult accusation overlooks the garden's openness and its role as a refuge for honest inquiry, not a sanctuary for hidden rites. By examining the historical context, the influences of Democritus's atomism and Aristippus's pleasure doctrine, the lived practices of shared meals and nightly dialogues, and the concrete anecdotes of Metrodorus's calm acceptance of death and Hermarchus's rise from slavery, we gain a richer portrait of Epicurus as a philosopher who responded thoughtfully to the social and political turbulence of his age. In contrast, the Stoics of the same period, Zeno and Cleanthes, chose a different route. They embraced the cosmic order and the rationality of the Logos, teaching that virtue alone suffices for happiness, regardless of external conditions. Both schools sought to free the individual from the tyranny of fear, yet they did so through distinct metaphysical commitments. Epicurus through a materialist universe devoid of divine meddling, the Stoics through a providential, rational cosmos. This divergence illustrates how philosophy can offer multiple, sometimes complementary, pathways to the same human longing for peace. As we reflect on the garden's legacy, we might ask ourselves, what would Epicurus say about our own age, where technology connects us across continents, yet many still feel isolated, where wealth is abundant for some and scarce for many, where the fear of death is amplified by rapid medical advancements and existential uncertainties? Perhaps he would invite us to gather around a simple table, to share a modest meal, to listen attentively to one another, and to remember that true pleasure lies not in the accumulation of external goods, but in the cultivation of a mind untroubled by unnecessary desires. In that invitation, the ancient garden still whispers, its olive trees rustling with the timeless promise that a tranquil life is within reach, provided we are willing to tend the soil of our own thoughts with care and humility. Pleasure in the ancient world of the Hellenic polis was not the glittering, hedonistic excess that modern advertising sometimes suggests. For Epicurus, the founder of a school that gathered beneath the shade of a modest garden in Athens, pleasure, hedon, was the very measure of a life well lived, but it was a pleasure defined not by indulgence, but by the gentle absence of pain, the quiet stillness of aponia. When we hear the phrase, "the highest good is pleasure," it can feel jarring, as if we are being invited to a banquet of unending indulgence. Yet, if we pause, listen to the rhythm of Epicurus' own words, we hear a different melody. Pleasure is the beginning and the end of a happy life. The key, however, lies in his careful distinction between fleeting, turbulent pleasures and the deeper, more enduring state of freedom from disturbance. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting in a modern therapist's office, describing the constant thrum of anxiety that accompanies each decision. The therapist might suggest a series of techniques. Breathing exercises, cognitive reframing, perhaps even a simple habit of keeping a gratitude journal. Each of these practices is aimed not at creating new, heightened sensations, but at removing the sharp edges of worry, the mental pain that keeps you awake at night. In Epicurean terms, this is precisely what aponia looks like, a state where the mind is no longer tormented by fear, where the body is free from the acute discomfort of illness or excess. The pleasure that follows is not a burst of ecstatic joy, but a serene, ongoing tranquility. It is the same kind of pleasure Epicurus described when he said, "The wise man does not fear death, for death is nothing to us. The fear itself is the pain." The removal of that fear is the pleasure. To understand how Epicurus built his ethical system around this notion, we must turn to the tetrapharmakos, the fourfold cure, a concise prescription that has survived millennia as a kind of ancient self-help guide. The term tetrapharmakos literally means four medicines, and each medicine is a proposition designed to cure the soul of the ailments that cause unnecessary suffering. Let us walk through each of these four statements, pausing to draw modern analogies that illuminate their relevance today. First, don't fear gods. Epicurus lived in a world where the divine was imagined as capricious, omnipotent beings who might intervene in human affairs at any moment. The fear of divine wrath was a source of constant anxiety for many citizens. Epicurus argued that the gods exist, but they are perfectly blissful, indifferent to human concerns, and therefore pose no threat. In contemporary terms, this is akin to the cognitive technique of challenging catastrophic thinking. When a person worries that a distant, unknowable force will ruin their life, the therapist invites them to examine the evidence. What proof do you have that this force exists, and even if it does, that it cares about your actions? By dismantling the irrational fear, the person experiences a reduction in anxiety, a modern aponia of the mind. The first medicine thus works like a mental vaccine against the dread of cosmic punishment. Second, don't worry about death. Epicurus famously declared, "Death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist." This statement is not a morbid denial of mortality, but a logical observation that the state in which we can experience pain or pleasure is precisely the state in which death has not yet arrived. In modern psychology, this mirrors the practice of exposure therapy for death anxiety, where individuals are guided to confront the idea of mortality in a safe environment, thereby diminishing its terror. Imagine a person who, after a serious illness, learns to view the end of life not as an ominous unknown, but as the natural cessation of sensation, a point at which the capacity for feeling, whether pleasure or pain, simply ceases. The relief that follows is a profound peace, a ataraxia that Epicurus prized above all else. Third, what is good is easy to obtain. Here Epicurus invites us to examine the natural and necessary desires that truly contribute to happiness. He distinguished between natural, necessary desires, such as the desire for food, shelter, friendship, and those that are vain or unnecessary, like the pursuit of endless wealth or fame. In a modern context, consider the principle of financial security, an emergency fund that covers 3 to 6 months of living expenses. This modest safety net is easy to obtain relative to the grandiose dream of a billionaire lifestyle, yet it eliminates a major source of stress, worry about sudden loss of income. By satisfying the basic, natural desires, we remove a substantial portion of mental disturbance, thereby moving closer to the pleasure that is the absence of pain. Fourth, what is terrible is easy to endure. Epicurus recognized that certain pains are inevitable: illness, loss, the occasional misfortune. Yet he argued that these pains are often exaggerated in our imagination, and that the mind can bear them when we understand their limits. This is strikingly similar to the modern practice of mindfulness-based stress reduction, where one learns to observe pain without judgment, recognizing that the sensation itself is transient. Think of a person who suffers a mild migraine. By acknowledging the pain, accepting its temporary nature, and perhaps employing a simple remedy, rest, hydration, a dimly lit room, the suffering becomes manageable. The medicine here is the mental training that turns a potentially overwhelming experience into a tolerable one. These four statements, when taken together, form a cohesive therapeutic regimen. They address the three primary sources of human distress that Epicurus identified: fear of the gods, fear of death, and the endless chase after unattainable desires. By applying each medicine, the individual cultivates a life that is not driven by the frantic pursuit of pleasure, but by the careful removal of the obstacles that block true tranquility. Let us now anchor these abstract ideas in two vivid historical examples that illustrate how Epicureans lived out their doctrine in concrete ways. The first example concerns the Epicurean approach to death. In the garden of Epicurus, a small circle of disciples would gather each evening, sharing simple meals of bread, olives, and wine, while discussing the nature of the universe. When one of the students, a young man named Leontius, confessed his terror of the afterlife, fueled by the traditional myths of Hades and punitive gods, Epicurus responded not with dogma, but with a logical demonstration. He drew a line in the sand and placed a stone on one side, representing life, and a second stone on the opposite side, representing death. He asked Leontius to point to the space between the stones. "There is none," Epicurus said, "for life and death are mutually exclusive." He then quoted the poet Sappho, "We do not have a day of the future, nor a day of the past." By emphasizing that there is no present in which death can affect us, Epicurus dissolved the fear that had plagued his student. The practical outcome was palpable. Leontius, freed from the dread of an imagined afterlife, could devote his energies to cultivating friendships and enjoying the modest pleasures of the garden, thereby embodying ataraxia. The second example involves the Epicurean treatment of disease through dietary moderation. In the Hellenistic world, the prevailing medical theories of the time, heavily influenced by Hippocratic humors, often advocated extreme regimens, excessive bloodletting, or the consumption of rare, costly foods believed to balance the body's elements. Epicurus, however, argued that the best medicine is a simple, balanced diet that does not overburden the body. He advised his followers to eat what is necessary and avoid what is superfluous. One anecdote records how a disciple named Philon, who suffered chronic stomach pains, was counseled to reduce his intake of rich, oily fish, a delicacy that, while socially prestigious, irritated his digestion. By returning to a modest fare of legumes, fresh fruit, and modest portions of cheese, Philon reported a marked decline in his discomfort. The pleasure he regained was not the fleeting delight of a gourmet feast, but the steady, pain-free existence that allowed him to engage in philosophical dialogue without distraction. This practice of moderation aligns with the modern concept of preventive health, choosing a diet that avoids the pain of chronic disease, thereby preserving the pleasure of everyday well-being. These historical moments are not isolated curiosities, they are living demonstrations of the tetrapharmakos in action. They show how the removal of fear, whether of divine wrath or death, and the careful calibration of desire can lead to a life that feels, to the Epicurean mind, genuinely pleasurable. Yet, as with any philosophical system, Epicureanism has faced rigorous scrutiny. Two prominent counterarguments have persisted through the ages, challenging the sufficiency and coherence of the pleasure-centered doctrine. The first challenge is the paradox of hedonism. The paradox, articulated by later thinkers such as John Stuart Mill and more recently by psychologists studying motivation, posits that the direct pursuit of pleasure often leads to its own frustration. When a person sets a goal of being happy all the time, the very act of monitoring happiness becomes a source of anxiety, undermining the desired state. In Epicurean terms, this paradox can be framed as a misreading of hedon. Epicurus did not advocate a relentless chase after ecstatic sensations. Instead, he emphasized the avoidance of pain and the cultivation of simple, sustainable pleasures. The paradox, therefore, does not so much refute Epicureanism as it highlights a common misunderstanding, that hedonism is synonymous with indulgence. If we reinterpret the paradox through the Epicurean lens, we see that the pursuit of ataraxia, the tranquil absence of disturbance, requires a subtle, indirect approach. One does not chase ataraxia directly. One creates the conditions, moderate desires, rational understanding of death, and a community of friends, under which ataraxia naturally arises. Modern research on flow states supports this. When individuals engage in activities for their own sake, without the explicit aim of feeling good, they often experience deep satisfaction. The paradox thus becomes a cautionary tale against a superficial reading of hedonism and an affirmation of Epicurus' nuanced prescription. The second critique targets the alleged undervaluation of higher pleasures, those associated with art, virtue, or intellectual achievement. Critics argue that Epicurus, by focusing on the avoidance of pain, reduces the richness of human experience to a minimalist baseline, neglecting the profound joy that can arise from, say, listening to a symphony or practicing a noble deed. To address this, we must revisit Epicurus' own hierarchy of pleasures. He distinguished between kinetic pleasures, those that involve a change of state, such as eating when hungry, and katasmatic pleasures, the stable state of satisfaction that follows the removal of a disturbance. While the former can be fleeting, the latter is enduring. Epicurus famously said, "The greatest good is a state of ataraxia, freedom from fear and aponia, the absence of bodily pain." Yet he also acknowledged that certain activities like philosophical discussion, friendship, and even the appreciation of beauty contribute to a lasting katasmatic pleasure. In his letter to Menocius he wrote, "Pleasure is the beginning and the end of a happy life," and elsewhere he noted that the wise man does not consider the enjoyment of a beautiful work of art to be a luxury, but a natural part of a tranquil life. Thus, higher pleasures are not dismissed. They are incorporated as part of the broader tapestry of ataraxia. The critique, then, often stems from a selective reading that isolates Epicurus' emphasis on pain avoidance while overlooking his affirmation of intellectual and aesthetic joys as essential components of a tranquil life. To deepen our understanding, let us compare Epicurean pleasure with Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia. Aristotle, writing a generation later, defined the highest good as activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. For Aristotle, flourishing is achieved through the exercise of rational virtues, courage, temperance, justice, within the context of a community. At first glance, the two visions seem at odds. Epicurus seeks a quiet garden of personal tranquility, while Aristotle envisions an active life of virtuous engagement. Yet both philosophers converge on the idea that the good life is not a chaotic pursuit of fleeting sensations, but a harmonious alignment of desire, reason, and social context. Aristotle's eudaimonia includes a component of pleasure, but he cautions that pleasure without virtue is empty. Epicurus, conversely, places the removal of pain at the foundation, but does not reject virtue. He regards friendship, modesty, and prudence as natural, necessary desires that lead to lasting pleasure. In a sense, the two can be seen as complementary. Aristotle provides the blueprint for the active cultivation of virtues, while Epicurus offers the therapeutic framework that guards against the anxieties and pains that could derail that cultivation. A modern practitioner might, for instance, follow an Aristotelian schedule of regular community service, a virtuous activity, while also employing Epicurean techniques, such as limiting exposure to distressing news, to maintain mental aponia. The synthesis of both traditions yields a robust model of flourishing that is both active and serene. Another fruitful cross-reference lies in Buddhist philosophy, particularly the Four Noble Truths, which diagnose suffering dukkha as arising from craving tanha and prescribe a path to its cessation. Epicurus and the Buddha share a striking similarity. Both locate the root of human distress in misguided desire and propose a disciplined approach to diminish it. The Buddhist concept of desire is the source of suffering mirrors Epicurus' claim that the desire for what is not natural and necessary is the source of endless disturbance. Yet there are also differences. Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence of all phenomena and the cultivation of compassion as central to liberation, whereas Epicurus focuses more on the rational assessment of natural desires and the maintenance of personal tranquility. Still, the overlap invites a dialogue. Could an Epicurean practice of measured desire be enriched by Buddhist mindfulness techniques? Imagine a person who, after reading both traditions, adopts a daily meditation that observes thoughts of longing without judgment, while also applying Epicurean prudence to limit material consumption. The result may be a hybrid practice that reduces both mental cravings and physical discomfort, achieving a double layer of aponia and nirva macron letter 1e47, two ancient roots to the same peaceful shore. Returning to the modern analogies that illuminate the tetrapharmakos, consider the first medicine, don't fear gods, through the lens of contemporary scientific humility. In an age where the cosmos is explored by telescopes that can peer billions of light years away, the ancient notion of capricious deities intervening in daily life seems out of place. Yet the underlying anxiety, fear of forces beyond our control, persists. People worry about climate change, pandemics, economic crashes, phenomena that feel as inscrutable as the whims of a deity. The Epicurean remedy, then, is to recognize the limits of what we can influence, to focus our energies on the domains where our actions matter, and to accept the rest with equanimity. This acceptance is not fatalism. It is a strategic allocation of mental resources, akin to an investor who diversifies a portfolio to mitigate risk. By refusing to expend emotional energy on the uncontrollable, we preserve our mental aponia for the pursuits that truly matter. The second medicine, don't worry about death, finds a parallel in the modern practice of mortality salience exercises used in existential psychology. Researchers ask participants to write about their own death, not to frighten them, but to help them prioritize what is genuinely valuable. When the fear of death is confronted directly, it loses its power to dominate the subconscious. In a practical sense, think of someone who, after a serious health scare, begins to cherish simple moments, a sunrise, a shared laugh, rather than obsess over accumulating wealth for an uncertain future. This shift reflects Epicurus' insight that once we recognize death as the natural end of sensation, we can redirect our focus to the present, where pleasure, understood as the absence of pain, resides. The third medicine, what is good is easy to obtain, can be illustrated by the concept of minimal viable happiness. In the tech world, startups aim for a minimum viable product, a version of a service that meets core needs without unnecessary features. Similarly, Epicurus suggests that we should identify the minimal set of desires that, when satisfied, produce a stable state of contentment. A modern example is the tiny house movement. People downsize their living spaces, reducing financial strain, and thereby eliminating the chronic anxiety associated with mortgages and maintenance. The pleasure derived is not the grandeur of a mansion, but the ease of living within one's means, a clear echo of Epicurus' third cure. The fourth medicine, what is terrible is easy to endure, resonates with contemporary resilience training. Consider a soldier returning from deployment who experiences chronic pain. Through physical therapy, cognitive reframing, and a supportive community, the soldier learns to reinterpret the pain not as a catastrophic failure of the body, but as a temporary obstacle that can be managed. This mirrors Epicurus' assertion that the greatest evil is not the pain itself, but the belief that it is unbearable. By correcting that belief, the pain becomes tolerable, and the individual regains a sense of agency. Let us now revisit the two historical examples, this time drawing out their philosophical significance in greater depth. When Epicurus taught his disciple Leontius that death is nothing to us, he was not merely offering comfort. He was providing a logical proof that the fear of non-existence is a false premise. The argument proceeds as follows: pleasure and pain are experiences that require a subject. Death, by definition, is the cessation of the subject. Therefore, death cannot be experienced, and thus cannot be a source of pain. If we accept this premise, the anxiety that stems from imagining a painful afterlife collapses. In the garden, this insight allowed Leontius to shift his mental energy from speculative dread to the cultivation of friendships, an activity that Epicurus identified as one of the most essential natural desires. The transformation illustrates how the second medicine operates not merely as an emotional balm, but as a rational restructuring of one's worldview, leading to a tangible reallocation of desire toward what is truly beneficial. The dietary moderation story of Philon underscores the practical application of the first two medicines, removing unnecessary desire and managing pain. By rejecting the socially endorsed indulgence of rich fish, Philon aligned his consumption with his bodily limits, thereby preventing the chronic stomach pain that had plagued him. This act of prudence, phronses, is a core Epicurean virtue. It demonstrates that the pursuit of pleasure is not a reckless sprint toward excess, but a disciplined walk that respects the body's natural thresholds. In contemporary terms, this is akin to the medical advice that encourages regular exercise and balanced nutrition to prevent lifestyle diseases. The pleasure that results is not the immediate gratification of a gourmet meal, but the long-term stability of health, a state where aponia is sustained. These anecdotes also reveal a broader social dimension of Epicureanism. The garden was not an isolated hermitage, it was a community of friends who shared meals, discussions, and mutual support. Epicurus famously said, "Of all the things which wisdom provides for the good life, the greatest is prudence, the second is justice, the third is modesty." Friendship, for Epicurus, was a natural desire that, when fulfilled, contributed directly to ataraxia. Modern research confirms this. Studies on social connectedness consistently show that strong relationships are among the most reliable predictors of happiness and longevity. In this sense, the Epicurean prescription anticipates contemporary findings in positive psychology, reinforcing the timelessness of his insight. Now, let us turn to the paradox of hedonism once more, but this time through the lens of empirical evidence. Psychologists have identified a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation, wherein individuals quickly return to a baseline level of happiness after positive or negative events. This suggests that the direct pursuit of pleasure, say, buying a new car, produces only a temporary uplift before the individual adapts and seeks the next source of stimulation. Epicurus, aware of human tendencies, would advise against such a chase. Instead, he would recommend focusing on stable, charismatic pleasures, those that do not fade quickly, such as deep friendships, philosophical contemplation, and the maintenance of bodily health. By anchoring one's life in these enduring sources, the paradox is sidestepped. Pleasure is not the moving target, but the steady horizon. The critique concerning higher pleasures can be enriched by examining Epicurus' own writings on art and music. In a fragment preserved by Diogenes Laertius, Epicurus notes that the enjoyment of a beautiful melody or a well-written poem is a pleasure that, when it is not accompanied by pain, adds to our happiness. He does not dismiss such pleasures. Rather, he places them within the hierarchy of natural and necessary desires. While a sumptuous banquet may be a fleeting kinetic pleasure, The appreciation of a well-crafted poem can foster ataraxia by engaging the intellect without overtaxing the body. Moreover, Epicurus recognized that the pursuit of such refined pleasures should be tempered by prudence. He warned against the luxury of excess, which can lead to dependency and eventual pain. In this way, the Epicurean view of higher pleasures is not a denial but a calibrated endorsement, ensuring that the enjoyment of art, music, or literature contributes to, rather than detracts from, the overall tranquility of life. To further illuminate the relationship between Epicurean pleasure and Buddhist desire, consider the Buddhist teaching of the middle way. The Buddha taught that a life of extreme asceticism, as well as a life of unrestrained indulgence, both generate suffering. The middle way advocates a balanced approach, avoiding both self-mortification and sensual excess. Epicurus similarly advocates a balanced life. He rejects the Stoic ideal of suppressing all passions, but he also rejects the hedonist's unbridled pursuit of sensual gratification. Both traditions converge on the insight that the path to peace lies in moderation, guided by wisdom. Yet, where Buddhism emphasizes the cessation of craving as a means to end dukkha, Epicurus emphasizes the accurate identification of natural, necessary cravings and the elimination of unnecessary ones. The two perspectives can be seen as complementary strategies for the same goal, a mind unburdened by unnecessary desire. Aristotle's eudaimonia and Epicurus' ataraxia also intersect when we consider the role of community. Aristotle famously argued that man is by nature a social animal, and that the good life is realized within a polis that allows the expression of virtue. Epicurus, though often portrayed as a recluse, built his garden precisely as a micropolis, a community of friends bound by shared values. In both cases, the social dimension is not an optional garnish but a necessary ingredient. The modern analogy might be a co-living space where individuals practice mindfulness together, share meals, and support each other's personal projects. The collective environment nurtures both the Aristotelian activity of virtue and the Epicurean peace of mind. Let us now synthesize these strands into a practical roadmap for the contemporary seeker who wishes to apply the tetrapharmakos in daily life. First, identify the sources of irrational fear. Write them down, perhaps fear of divine punishment, fear of death, fear of losing status. For each, ask, is there evidence that this fear will actually cause pain? If the answer is no, then consciously release the fear, perhaps through a brief meditation that visualizes the fear as a cloud passing overhead. This is the first medicine in action. Second, confront the inevitability of death. Reflect on the Epicurean insight that when death arrives, sensation ceases. Imagine the moment of non-sensation as a gentle fading of a candle's flame, not a violent extinguishing, but a natural conclusion. By holding this image, the anxiety that often fuels endless striving can loosen its grip, allowing you to focus on present pleasures. Third, audit your desires. List the things you consider essential for happiness: food, shelter, meaningful conversation, health. Then list the luxuries you chase: designer clothing, the latest gadget, status symbols. Evaluate which of these are truly necessary. Prioritize the essentials and set realistic limits on the luxuries. This mirrors the third cure. What is good is easy to obtain. Fourth, practice endurance of inevitable discomfort. When a minor ailment or an unavoidable inconvenience arises, observe it without judgment. Recognize that pain is a signal, not a verdict. Use techniques such as deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or simply counting to 10. Over time, you will find that many terrible experiences become manageable, confirming the fourth medicine. Incorporating these steps into a daily routine does not demand a radical life overhaul. It is akin to the habit of brushing one's teeth each morning, a small, consistent act that yields long-term health benefits. Over weeks, the cumulative effect is a mind less cluttered with fear, a body less burdened by unnecessary cravings, and a soul more attuned to the quiet pleasures that Epicurus held dear. To close, let us revisit the words of Epicurus that have guided generations. The art of living well and the art of dying well are one. This single sentence captures the unity of his doctrine. The same rational clarity that frees us from the terror of death also guides us toward the prudent satisfaction of daily life. By embracing the tetrapharmakos, by recognizing that true pleasure is the gentle absence of pain, and by balancing our desires with reason, we step into a garden, not unlike the one in ancient Athens, where the scent of olives and the murmur of friendly conversation remind us that happiness is less a thunderous applause and more a soft, steady hum. In that hum we find the echo of ataraxia, the echo of aponia, and perhaps, across the centuries, the echo of our own timeless longing for a life lived without unnecessary suffering. What if the universe were not a grand stage for divine puppeteers, but a vast expanse of tiny, indivisible specks, each moving according to its own simple law. Imagine a world where the only actors are particles, drifting through an endless void, colliding, clumping, and occasionally, by a tiny, unpredictable nudge, changing direction. This is the picture that Epicurus inherited from the pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, and it is the foundation upon which he built a philosophy of freedom, tranquility, and the removal of superstition. In this segment, we will follow the path from the early atomists to Epicurus' subtle modification of their physics, explore how that physics underwrites his ethical claim that the gods are indifferent, and see how this ancient vision still echoes in modern materialist thought. We will travel through letters, poetry, and scientific critique, and we will pause often to ask, what does it mean for a soul to be a collection of atoms? And what does this swerve tell us about chance, responsibility, and the possibility of a life free from fear? The atomist tradition begins with Leucippus, a name that flickers in the shadows of history, and then with Democritus, the laughing philosopher who delighted in the idea that everything could be reduced to the indivisible. Democritus wrote, "Nothing exists except atoms and void." For him, the cosmos was a boundless vacuum in which countless, eternally moving atoms collided, combined, and separated, giving rise to the manifold forms we observe. Atoms were eternal, unchangeable, and infinite in number. The void was equally eternal, a necessary counterpart that allowed motion. In this picture, there was no need for a divine craftsman, no teleology guiding the dance of matter. Everything followed from necessity, necessity of motion, necessity of collision. Epicurus, born in 341 BC on the island of Samos, encountered this atomistic inheritance during his early studies in Athens. He admired the elegance of a universe explained without gods, yet he sensed a missing piece. Democritus' atoms moved in perfectly straight lines unless they struck another atom. Such a deterministic universe left no room for the spontaneous, for the unexpected, for human agency. Epicurus introduced a modest but profound amendment, the klinemen, the swerve. In his own words, preserved in the fragmentary collection of his letters, atoms moving through the void are not always moving in the same line. They deviate at times, for the swerve is a cause of the random, and the random is the cause of the free. The swerve is a tiny, unpredictable deflection, an indeterminacy that prevents the infinite regress of atoms locked in a perfectly ordered chain. Why is this swerve so important? Think of a row of billiard balls on a perfectly smooth table, each struck in turn, each moving in a straight line. If the table were perfectly smooth and the balls perfectly rigid, the motion would be entirely predictable. You could calculate the final position of every ball from the initial strike. The universe would be a clockwork, and free will would be an illusion. By inserting the swerve, Epicurus cracks the clockwork. The slightest random deviation at the atomic level cascades upward, allowing for events that are not strictly determined by prior states. It is a philosophical hedge against fatalism, a way to preserve moral responsibility without invoking a divine overseer. Epicurus' physics did not stop at the swerve. He also refined the nature of the void. For Democritus, the void was an empty, inert backdrop, merely the space that allowed atoms to move. Epicurus emphasized that the void is not a passive emptiness, but a dynamic arena where atoms can separate, combine, and disperse. In his letter to Menocius, he writes, "The void is the emptiness which separates the atoms. It is not a thing, but the absence of things." This subtle shift underscores a universe that is not static but alive with possibilities, where the absence of matter is itself a condition for motion. Now let us turn to the ethical implications of this physics. If the cosmos is composed solely of atoms and void, and if the gods, if they exist at all, are themselves made of the same material and reside in a state of perfect bliss, then what role can they possibly play in human affairs? Epicurus famously claimed that the gods exist, but they are completely indifferent to us. He wrote, "The gods live in a state of perfect happiness and are completely uninterested in human matters." The gods, in this view, are not tyrants, not judges, not creators who intervene when we err. They are, in a sense, the ultimate exemplars of a tranquil life, but they do not meddle. This claim is not a denial of divinity, but a strategic removal of divine interference from the ethical sphere. Why does this matter? Consider the ancient world, where omens, oracles, and divine wrath were woven into the fabric of daily decision-making. Fear of the gods could dominate a person's choices, leading to anxiety, superstition, and the sacrifice of personal happiness for appeasement. Epicurus argued that such fear is irrational because the gods, being perfect and immutable, have no need or desire to influence the mutable world of mortals. By grounding his ethics in a physics that excludes divine causation, he frees the individual from the shackles of religious anxiety. The only forces that affect us are natural, material, and, thanks to the swerve, partly indeterminate. Thus, the path to ataraxia, peace of mind, lies in understanding the world as it is, not as the gods might make it. To illustrate how Epicurus applied this view to the nature of the soul, we turn to a charming anecdote preserved in the so-called Epicurean letter to Herodotus. In this fictional correspondence, Epicurus explains to the historian Herodotus that the soul, like the body, is composed of fine, delicate atoms that disperse at death. He writes, when the soul is dissolved, it spreads out in the void, like a fine mist that has been scattered by a sudden wind. This image is both poetic and materialist. The soul is not an immortal, immaterial spark that survives beyond the grave. It is a temporary configuration of atoms that, once the body ceases to function, returns to the void. The letter also emphasizes that because the soul is mortal, there is no reason to fear divine punishment after death. The fear of the afterlife, Epicurus argued, is a superstition born of ignorance of the true nature of the soul. The letter's tone is intimate, almost conversational, as if Epicurus were sitting across a table from Herodotus, sharing a cup of wine and a simple explanation. It reflects Epicurus' pedagogical method. He sought to demystify the cosmos for his friends, to replace fear with understanding. This anecdote also shows how Epicurus used his physics to answer questions that were, for many, the domain of religion. By explaining the soul in atomic terms, he provided a naturalistic answer to the age-old question of what happens after death, thereby reinforcing his broader ethical program of eliminating fear of divine retribution. The Roman poet Lucretius, living 3 centuries later, took Epicurus' physics and transformed it into a lyrical masterpiece, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. In Book I, Lucretius opens with a vivid image. We are like leaves blown by the wind, drifting through the void, carried by forces we cannot see. He proceeds to describe the swerve in poetic terms, calling it the slightest trembling, the tiniest deviation. That breaks the straightness of the atoms. Lucretius writes, and because of that trembling, the atoms that were once locked in an endless chain are set free, and the universe is filled with the possibility of new forms. This poetic rendering made Epicurean atomism accessible to a broad audience, and it cemented the idea that the universe is a place of constant flux, not a static arena ruled by gods. Lucretius also dramatizes the indifference of the gods. In Book III he declares, "The gods do not concern themselves with the affairs of mortals, they dwell in perfect bliss, untouched by our sorrows." He uses the metaphor of a distant, shining sun that warms the earth but never intervenes in the affairs of the creatures below. By presenting the gods as detached observers, Lucretius reinforces Epicurus' claim that divine interference is a myth, and that the only things that truly affect us are the material causes we can observe. These 2 anecdotes, the letter to Herodotus and Lucretius' poetic exposition, serve as concrete illustrations of how Epicurus' atomistic physics translates into ethical guidance. They show a continuity of thought from the intimate philosophical dialogue of the Greek garden to the grand, sweeping verses of a Roman poet. Both works aim to replace fear with knowledge, superstition with natural explanation, and in doing so, they open a space for human freedom. But Epicurus' atomism was not without its critics, even in antiquity. The most persistent ancient objection came from the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition, which argued that atomism could not account for consciousness, for the unity of the self, for the experience of thought. Aristotle in his Metaphysics wrote that the soul is the form of a living body, not a mere aggregation of parts. From this perspective, if the soul were just a heap of atoms, how could it possess the unity required for rational thought? The critique goes further. If atoms are indivisible, how can they combine to produce something as indivisible as consciousness? This line of criticism suggests that materialism, as presented by Epicurus, leaves a gap when it comes to explaining the mind. Epicurus responded, albeit indirectly, by emphasizing that the soul's atoms are fine and subtle, and that their arrangement gives rise to the functions of perception and thought. He argued that the properties of the soul emerge from the particular configuration of its atoms, much as the hardness of a diamond emerges from the arrangement of carbon atoms. In this view, consciousness is an emergent property, not a fundamental substance. While he did not develop a full theory of emergence, such language would belong to a later era. His intuition anticipates contemporary philosophical discussions about how mental states arise from physical substrates. A second, more modern, challenge to Epicurean atomism comes from quantum mechanics. The classical picture of solid, indivisible atoms moving in deterministic paths through an empty void is at odds with the probabilistic nature of subatomic particles revealed by 20th century physics. In the quantum world, particles exhibit wave-particle duality, exist in superpositions, and are described by probability amplitudes rather than precise trajectories. The notion of a swerve as a random deviation seems quaint compared to the inherent indeterminacy built into the Schrödinger equation. Moreover, the void is no longer empty. It is a seething vacuum filled with fluctuating fields and virtual particles. How does this modern scientific picture affect Epicurus' philosophical project? Some scholars argue that the spirit of the swerve, an acknowledgement that the universe is not strictly deterministic, finds a natural ally in quantum indeterminacy. Epicurus' willingness to admit a fundamental randomness at the atomic level can be seen as a precursor, albeit a primitive one, to the probabilistic interpretation of quantum events. Others contend that the atomist model, with its solid, indivisible particles, is simply obsolete, and that Epicurus' physics must be revised or abandoned in light of modern science. Yet even if the specific details of his atomic theory are outdated, the broader philosophical move, using a naturalistic, materialist framework to dissolve superstition, remains robust. The core insight that the universe can be explained without invoking capricious divine agency survives the shift from classical atoms to quantum fields. The legacy of Epicurus materialism reverberates through later thinkers who embraced a world of matter and motion. Lucretius, as we have seen, carried the torch into Roman culture. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes famously declared, "The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short," a stark materialist view that echoed Epicurean emphasis on the natural world and the denial of supernatural interference. Hobbes, in his Leviathan, argued that all mental phenomena are motions of matter, a direct line from the atomistic idea that thoughts are configurations of fine particles. He even borrowed the term mechanical to describe the workings of the mind, echoing Epicurus' image of the soul as a delicate arrangement of atoms. In the 20th century, the physicalist tradition in philosophy of mind, think of the works of J.J.C. Smart, David Papineau, or the identity theory, continues the Epicurean project of locating mental states in the physical. The claim that mental states are brain states is a modern articulation of the same principle that the soul, for Epicurus, is nothing over and above a particular atomic composition. Even contemporary debates about panpsychism, which posit that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, can be traced back to the ancient tension between atomism and the experience of mind. The Epicurean solution, emergent consciousness from material arrangements, still informs these discussions. Let us return for a moment to the swerve and its ethical implications. If the universe is not a clockwork, if there is genuine indeterminacy at the most fundamental level, then the future is not pre-written. This opens a space for moral responsibility. Epicurus believed that the swerve gave humans the capacity to act freely, to pursue pleasure and avoid pain based on rational calculation, not because a divine decree has already set their path. He wrote, "The greatest good is prudence, and the greatest evil is imprudence." Prudence, in his view, is the ability to assess the natural consequences of one's actions, knowing that the gods will not intervene, that the atoms will behave according to natural law, but also that the swerve allows for unforeseen outcomes. This is a call to personal responsibility, not a resignation to fate. Consider an everyday analogy. Imagine you are sailing across a calm sea. If the wind were perfectly steady and predictable, you could plot a course that would guarantee arrival at a specific port. But in reality, the wind gusts, the currents shift, and a sudden squall can throw your vessel off course. The swerve is that sudden gust, a small, random disturbance that forces you to adjust, to make choices, to navigate. The existence of the gust does not mean you cannot sail. It means you must be attentive, you must develop skill, and you must accept that some aspects of the journey are beyond your control. Epicurus invites us to become skilled sailors of the atomistic sea, guided by reason, untroubled by the fear that a deity will capsize us at any moment. Now, let us examine how this philosophy plays out in concrete human concerns. First, the fear of divine punishment. In the ancient world, the belief that the gods would mete out justice after death was a powerful social regulator. Epicurus dismantles this by showing that the gods are indifferent and that the soul dissolves at death. If there is no afterlife, the only consequences of our actions are those we experience in this life. Therefore, ethical behavior should be motivated not by fear of heavenly retribution, but by the pursuit of pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and the avoidance of unnecessary distress. This is a radical reorientation. Ethics becomes a matter of personal well-being, grounded in natural causes, rather than a response to divine command. Second, the anxiety about natural disasters. In many ancient cultures, earthquakes, storms, and plagues were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Epicurus, using his atomistic physics, explains that such events are the result of the random motion of atoms, the swerve, and the natural interactions of matter. A sudden shift in the Earth's atoms can cause a quake. A collision of atmospheric particles can produce a storm. By attributing these phenomena to natural causes, Epicurus removes the need to fear a wrathful deity. He writes, "Nature is not angry, it simply follows its own laws." This perspective encourages a calm acceptance of the world's volatility, fostering resilience rather than helpless dread. These applications illustrate how Epicurus' physics is not a mere speculative exercise, but a practical tool for mental tranquility. By understanding the mechanisms behind the world, we replace mythic explanations with empirical ones, and in doing so we free ourselves from superstition. The swerve, though minute, becomes a symbol of the freedom that arises when we recognize that the universe does not conspire against us. Let us now turn to the historical anecdotes that bring these ideas to life. The first anecdote involves the famous Epicurean garden in Athens, a modest plot of land where Epicurus gathered his followers. According to Diogenes Laertius, a young man named Leontychus once entered the garden, trembling with fear after a dream in which a thunderstorm was interpreted as a sign of Zeus's anger. Epicurus, with a gentle smile, invited him to sit under the shade of an olive tree and explain the nature of the swerve. He pointed to the dust on the ground and said, "Every grain of sand is an atom, and every gust that lifts it is the swerve. The storm you feared is no more than a collection of atoms moving in ways we cannot fully predict, but there is no God behind it." Leontychus left the garden with a calm mind, his fear replaced by curiosity. This story captures the pedagogical spirit of Epicurus, using everyday observations, dust, wind, sand, to illustrate profound metaphysical points. The second anecdote comes from the Roman Empire, when the poet Virgil in his Aeneid describes the gods as the immutable, unshaken, eternal. A contemporary Roman critic, aware of Lucretius' teachings, responded by saying, "If the gods are truly indifferent, why do we hear them in the thunder?" The critic, a follower of Epicurean thought, replied, "Because the thunder is the clash of atoms, not the voice of a deity. The gods hear nothing, for they are already in perfect bliss." This witty retort, preserved in a fragment of a lost commentary, shows how Epicurean ideas were used to challenge the traditional religious narratives, even in the height of Roman religiosity. It also demonstrates how the concept of an indifferent God could be wielded as a rhetorical weapon against superstition. These anecdotes, though brief, illuminate how Epicurus' physics was lived, debated, and employed in everyday discourse. They remind us that philosophy was not confined to ivory towers. It was a lived practice, a conversation over wine, a response to the rustle of leaves, a challenge to the thunder of the heavens. Let us now explore how later materialist thinkers have built upon or diverged from Epicurus' framework. Lucretius, as we have seen, preserved the core atomistic ideas while expanding them poetically. In the Enlightenment, the French philosopher Pierre Gassendi revived Epicurean atomism as a counterpoint to Cartesian dualism, arguing that the world is composed of particles moving in a void, and that the soul is a material phenomenon. Gassendi's materialist stance influenced the development of modern science, especially the mechanistic worldview of Newtonian physics. Yet Gassendi also introduced the idea of occasionalism, a theological doctrine that God occasionally intervenes in the natural order, thus diverging from Epicurus' strict indifference. Thomas Hobbes, as mentioned earlier, took the atomistic picture and pushed it toward a deterministic materialism. He famously claimed that the imagination is a motion of the brain, reducing mental life to mechanical motion. However, Hobbes rejected the swerve, embracing a fully deterministic universe governed by laws of motion. For Hobbes, freedom is not a metaphysical indeterminacy, but the absence of external constraints. This shift illustrates a key divergence. While Epicurus used the swerve to safeguard moral freedom, Hobbes found freedom in the capacity of the mind to calculate and predict within a deterministic system. In the 20th century, the logical positivists, such as A.J. Ayer, echoed Epicurean empiricism, insisting that meaningful statements must be verifiable through sensory experience. Their rejection of metaphysical claims about the soul parallels Epicurus' denial of an immortal, immaterial soul. Yet, logical positivists often dismiss the swerve as a metaphysical filler, preferring a purely deterministic physics. In contrast, contemporary physicalists like David Papineau argue that consciousness, while emergent, can be fully explained by neurobiological processes. Again, a modern echo of Epicurus' claim that the soul is nothing over and above a particular atomic arrangement. Quantum mechanics, however, reintroduces indeterminacy in a formal way. The Copenhagen interpretation posits that at the subatomic level, events are fundamentally probabilistic. Some philosophers, such as Karl Popper, have drawn a line from Epicurus' clinamen to quantum randomness, suggesting that Epicurus anticipated a universe where chance plays a role. Others, like the deterministic Bohmian interpretation, argue that hidden variables restore a form of determinism, thereby challenging the necessity of a swerve. The ongoing debate mirrors the ancient tension between determinism and indeterminism that Epicurus sought to resolve. What about the modern debate over physicalism versus dualism? Physicalism, the view that everything that exists is physical, can be seen as a direct descendant of Epicurean materialism. The claim that mental states are brain states, that consciousness is a product of neural activity, and that there is no need to posit a non-material soul, all trace their lineage back to the ancient garden of Samos. Yet physicalists must grapple with the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from objective matter, a problem Epicurus did not face in the same terms. Some contemporary philosophers propose property dualism, arguing that while the world is made of physical substances, there are non-physical properties, like qualia. Epicurus would likely have dismissed such a move as an unnecessary multiplication of entities, preferring to explain everything in terms of atoms and void. Let us pause and reflect on why this ancient physics still matters. In a world saturated with information, where scientific explanations abound, many people still cling to supernatural explanations for misfortune, for disease, for the meaning of life. The Epicurean project offers a template for addressing these fears. First, understand the natural causes. Second, recognize the limits of what is determined. Third, accept that the gods, if they exist, are indifferent. By doing so, we can cultivate a mental state that is both rational and serene. The swerve reminds us that uncertainty is a feature, not a bug, of the universe. It invites us to embrace the unknown without panicking, to act responsibly despite the lack of absolute predictability. In practical terms, how might an Epicurean approach a modern dilemma, such as climate change? An Epicurean would begin by examining the material causes, the increase of greenhouse gases, the physics of radiative forcing, the feedback loops in the climate system. Recognizing that these processes are governed by natural laws, not divine will, the Epicurean would reject the notion that the catastrophe is a punishment from the gods. At the same time, the swerve reminds us that there is an element of unpredictability, tipping points, sudden shifts, so we must act prudently and promptly. The ethical goal becomes the reduction of suffering, both present and future, by minimizing pain, environmental degradation, and maximizing pleasure, stable ecosystems. This example shows how Epicurus physics can be applied to contemporary ethical challenges, providing a framework that is both naturalistic and action-oriented. Another modern application lies in the realm of mental health. Anxiety often stems from the fear of uncontrollable forces, whether they be divine wrath, fate, or the unknown. By adopting the Epicurean view that the universe operates through material causes and that the gods are indifferent, we can reframe anxiety as a misinterpretation of natural processes. Cognitive behavioral therapy, in a sense, mirrors Epicurean practice. It teaches individuals to examine the evidence of their thoughts, to replace irrational fears with rational explanations, and to focus on actions that reduce distress. The swerve, as a metaphor for unexpected emotional shifts, reminds us that mood fluctuations are natural and not evidence of a malevolent cosmic order. In this way, Epicurus offers a philosophical complement to modern psychotherapy. Now let us consider the role of community in the Epicurean project. The garden was not just a place of lecture. It was a community of friends who shared meals, discussed philosophy, and supported each other in the pursuit of ataraxia. Epicurus believed that friendship was essential for a tranquil life, because friends provide security, help us correct false beliefs, and share in the pleasures of simple conversation. This social dimension is grounded in his physics. If we are all made of atoms moving through the void, then we are, at a fundamental level, part of the same material whole. Our bonds are not metaphysical miracles, but natural associations of atoms that enhance well-being. The swerve again plays a role. The chance meeting of atoms can lead to the formation of friendships, underscoring the importance of openness to the unexpected. In sum, Epicurus took Democritus' elegant but rigid atomism and injected it with a dose of indeterminacy, the clinamen, to safeguard human freedom. He used this physics to argue that the gods, even if they exist, are detached from human affairs, thereby removing divine interference from moral decision-making. He illustrated his ideas through vivid anecdotes, the letter to Herodotus describing the soul's atomic dissolution, and Lucretius' poetic rendering of the swerve, making the abstract concrete. He faced ancient criticism that atomism could not explain consciousness, a challenge he met by appealing to emergent properties of atomic configurations, a line of thought that anticipates modern philosophy of mind. He also anticipated modern scientific concerns. The quantum indeterminacy that replaces classical determinism mirrors his clinamen, while the detailed structure of atoms has been superseded by subatomic particles and fields. Yet the philosophical core, the commitment to a naturalistic, superstition-free worldview, continues to inspire materialist thinkers from Hobbes to contemporary physicalists. The Epicurean vision invites us to look at the world not as a theater of divine whims, but as a dynamic interplay of particles, void, and chance. It asks us to replace fear of the gods with an understanding of natural causes, to replace anxiety about the afterlife with a focus on present pleasure and the avoidance of pain, and to cultivate friendships that ground us in the shared material reality. As we navigate the complexities of the modern age, climate crises, mental health challenges, scientific revolutions, we can still hear the echo of Epicurus' garden, whispering that tranquility is possible when we see the world for what it truly is. A vast, atom-filled expanse, occasionally swerving, always indifferent, and always offering us the chance to live wisely and peacefully. Imagine a quiet garden at the edge of ancient Athens, shaded by olive trees, the scent of thyme drifting on a gentle breeze. In that modest plot of earth, a small group of men and women gathered each evening, not to debate politics or to display wealth, but to share a simple meal, a conversation, and a sense of belonging. This was the Garden of Epicurus, a place where the philosopher's most enduring ethical insight took root, that friendship, simplicity, and community are the foundations of a tranquil life. When we speak of Epicurus, we often hear the shorthand, pleasure is the good. Yet the pleasure he champions is not the fleeting thrill of excess, but a deep, steady contentment that arises when our desires are modest, our bodies are nourished without indulgence, and our souls are wrapped in the warm embrace of true friends. In this segment, we will walk through the heart of that teaching, exploring how Epicurus understood friendship, philia, as essential to the good life, how he prescribed a modest way of living, and how those ideas have resonated through centuries, from the Roman Epicurean communities of the 2nd century CE to today's minimalist movements and scientific studies of social support. Let us begin with the bond that Epicurus cherished most, his friendship with Metrodorus of Lampsacus. Metrodorus was not merely a student, he was the philosopher's closest confidant, a brother in thought and practice. According to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, Metrodorus arrived at the garden at a young age, drawn by the promise of a life free from the anxieties that plagued the city. Epicurus welcomed him with the words that have echoed through the ages, "I will give you a home, a table, and a place among my friends. In return, you shall bring me your mind and your love of philosophy." Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared meals of simple barley bread and olives, and long discussions that stretched long after the sun had set. Epicurus once wrote, "Of all the things which wisdom provides for living well, the greatest is the friendship of good men." In the garden, that statement was lived out daily. When Metrodorus fell ill, the community rallied around him, providing care, soothing words, and a reminder that his value was not measured by wealth or status, but by the affection he inspired. Their friendship illustrates a core Epicurean claim, that the presence of trustworthy companions reduces fear, mitigates pain, and amplifies pleasure. The philosopher did not view friendship as a luxury. He saw it as a therapeutic remedy, a natural antidote to the disturbances that arise when we are alone. Now consider the Roman Epicurean community of the 2nd century CE, a later but equally vivid illustration of Epicurus's social ethic. In the bustling city of Rome, a group of affluent citizens, senators, merchants, and freedmen, formed a collegium that met in a modest house near the Aventine Hill. They called themselves the Amici Epicuri, the Friends of Epicurus. Their gatherings were marked not by opulent banquets, but by modest meals of boiled vegetables, lentils, and a modest cup of wine, shared in a setting that resembled the original garden more than any Roman villa. One surviving letter, preserved in the papyrus collection of Oxyrhynchus, recounts a meeting in which the members debated whether to purchase a new marble statue for their meeting room. Lucius, a wealthy merchant, argued that a beautiful statue would honor the philosopher's memory. Gaius, however, replied, If the statue does not bring us closer to tranquility, it is merely a burden of desire. The group ultimately decided against the purchase, choosing instead to spend the funds on a public well for the poor neighborhood. This decision encapsulated the Epicurean principle that unnecessary desires, those that do not contribute to ataraxia, the calm of the mind, should be set aside in favor of actions that nurture the community and reduce suffering. These two case studies, Epicurus and Metrodorus in the Greek garden, and the Roman Amici Epicuri in the bustling capital, show us that the philosophers' ethics of friendship and simplicity were not abstract theories but lived practices. They demonstrate how a community can be built on modest means, shared values, and a collective commitment to tranquility. But what does simple living mean in the Epicurean context? It is more than frugality. It is a disciplined discernment between natural, necessary desires and those that are superfluous. Epicurus divided desires into three categories: natural and necessary, such as food, shelter, and friendship; natural but unnecessary, such as fine wines or elaborate clothing; and neither natural nor necessary, such as fame, power, or excessive wealth. He argued that the first category should be satisfied, the second pursued only if they do not disturb the soul, and the third avoided altogether. In practical terms, Epicurus advised a diet of modest portions, emphasizing foods that are easy to digest and unlikely to cause pain. He famously recommended a meal of bread, cheese, and fruit, noting that the greatest pleasure is to be found in a simple meal, not in a banquet of excess. He also warned against the gluttony of the mind, the endless craving for more knowledge without the capacity to integrate it. In a letter to his disciple Pythagoras, he wrote, "Do not let your mind be filled with a multitude of opinions, for it will become restless and unable to find peace." These dietary and lifestyle recommendations were not merely about physical health. They were intimately tied to the emotional and psychological well. By limiting the body's demands, one reduces the mind's anxieties about scarcity, loss, or the need to maintain a certain status. In the garden, meals were shared in silence for a few moments, allowing each participant to savor the taste, feel gratitude, and notice the comforting presence of others. This ritual of mindful eating is strikingly similar to modern practices in Buddhist sanghas, where monks and laypeople alike sit together, eat simply, and reflect on the interdependence of all beings. Let us pause for a moment and consider an analogy that captures the Epicurean view of desire. Imagine a river that flows steadily toward the sea. The water that moves directly toward the ocean represents natural and necessary desires: food, shelter, companionship. Along the banks there are many pebbles and branches. Some of these obstacles are small, like a stone that merely nudges the current, representing natural but unnecessary wants, such as a desire for a fancier meal. Larger branches, however, can block the flow entirely, symbolizing the superfluous desires for fame or power that divert the river's energy away from its true destination. An Epicurean seeks to clear the river's path, removing the large branches while allowing the small stones to settle naturally. In doing so, the water reaches the sea swiftly and without turbulence, just as the soul reaches tranquility when it is unburdened by unnecessary cravings. Now let us turn to the first major counterargument, the claim that Epicurean simplicity is elitist, accessible only to those who have the means to withdraw from the pressures of daily life. Critics point out that the original garden was funded by Epicurus's own wealth, and that his followers, especially in Rome, were often members of the upper class who could afford to spare time for philosophy. How then can a doctrine that emphasizes modest living be applied by the poor, the laborer, the enslaved? In response, we must recall that Epicurus did not equate simplicity with poverty. Rather, he distinguished between necessity and luxury. A poor farmer, for example, may lack material abundance, but can still practice Epicurean moderation by focusing on the essential. A stable roof, a modest meal, and the companionship of family. The philosopher's own words provide guidance. It is not the man who has little, but the man who wants more, who is in misery. Moreover, the Roman Amici Epicuri deliberately chose to spend money on public works rather than private extravagance, showing that wealth could be redirected toward communal benefit, thereby extending the benefits of tranquility to those beyond the immediate circle. The modern minimalist movement offers a concrete illustration of how Epicurean simplicity can be democratized. Minimalists such as Joshua Fields Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, known as the minimalists, emphasize that decluttering one's possessions and focusing on relationships yields greater freedom and happiness, regardless of income level. Their mantra, "Own less, live more," mirrors Epicurus's advice to live in such a way that you do not have to be anxious about losing what you have. Scientific studies support this convergence. A 2017 paper in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin found that individuals who reported higher levels of material minimalism also reported greater life satisfaction and lower levels of depressive symptoms. The research suggests that the reduction of unnecessary desires, a core Epicurean principle, has measurable benefits for mental health across socioeconomic strata. The second counterargument comes from the Stoic tradition, which famously critiqued the Epicurean emphasis on friendship as the cornerstone of moral life. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "If you think that your happiness depends on the affection of others, you are still a slave to external things." For Stoics, virtue is the only true good, and moral worth is grounded in rational self-governance, not in the bonds of affection. They feared that reliance on friendship could make one vulnerable to loss and thus undermine inner stability. Epicurus anticipated this critique and responded by redefining the nature of friendship. He argued that true friends are not merely external sources of pleasure, but extensions of our own rational nature. In the letter to Menocius, he wrote, "When we are surrounded by friends, we are surrounded by those who have cultivated the same understanding of what is good." In other words, friendship is a mutual reinforcement of rational judgment, not a fragile dependency. Contemporary research on social support validates this view. A meta-analysis by Holt Lundstad, Smith, and Layton, 2010, concluded that strong social connections increase the likelihood of survival by 50%, comparable to the effects of quitting smoking. The protective effect arises not from the mere presence of others, but from the shared sense of meaning, trust, and mutual aid, exactly the qualities Epicurus highlighted. To deepen our appreciation, let us revisit a historical anecdote from the garden that illustrates the Stoic critique and Epicurean reply. One evening, a young man named Hermarchus entered the garden, visibly upset because his sister had died unexpectedly. He lamented, "How can I find peace when I have lost the one I love most?" Epicurus responded, not by dismissing his grief, but by reminding him of the nature of desire. "You mourn the loss of a body which is perishable, yet you cling to the idea that her presence was necessary for your happiness." He then invited Hermarchus to sit with Metrodorus, who shared a story of his own loss, emphasizing that the memory of a loved one can become a source of tranquil reflection if one focuses on the shared moments of virtue rather than the absence of the physical form. This compassionate dialogue shows how Epicurean friendship serves as a therapeutic space where grief is transformed, rather than a fragile crutch that shatters under loss. Another anecdote from the Roman community further illustrates the Stoic critique turned on its head. The Amici Epicuri once faced a political crisis when a senator demanded that they support a military campaign. The group, valuing their peace, refused. The senator accused them of cowardice, arguing that a true citizen must place public duty above personal tranquility. The Epicureans replied, "Our duty is to preserve our own minds from disturbance. By refusing to fund war, we protect countless lives from the suffering that conflict brings." In this exchange, friendship and community become the vehicle for ethical action, not a withdrawal from civic responsibility. Their stance aligns with the modern concept of ethical minimalism, where individuals limit their participation in harmful systems while fostering supportive networks that promote well-being. Having examined the primary arguments, let us now explore how Epicurus's ethics of friendship and simplicity reverberate in contemporary thought. One fruitful comparison lies with the Buddhist Sangha. Both traditions view the community as a sanctuary for practice, a place where individuals support one another in the pursuit of a liberated mind. In the Buddhist Dhammapada we read, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Similarly, Epicurus wrote, "The wise man will be free from the fear of death, because he knows that death is nothing to us." Both sayings point to the idea that the presence of a compassionate community can dissolve existential anxiety. Moreover, the practice of right livelihood in Buddhism, which encourages honest, non-exploitative work, resonates with Epicurean moderation. Avoid occupations that generate excessive desire or cause harm to others, and instead seek work that sustains the body without inflaming the mind. From a psychological perspective, the modern field of positive psychology has identified social connectedness as one of the 5 pillars of well-being. Martin Seligman, in his PERMA model, lists relationships as a core component, arguing that high-quality friendships are essential for a flourishing life. Empirical studies, such as the longitudinal Harvard study of adult development, have repeatedly shown that close relationships predict longer, healthier lives more robustly than wealth or fame. This scientific validation aligns with Epicurus's claim that the presence of a friend is a source of happiness greater than any wealth. Furthermore, research on minimalist consumption demonstrates that reducing material possessions can free cognitive resources for social interaction. A 2020 study in Journal of Consumer Research found that participants who decluttered their living spaces reported higher levels of social engagement and lower stress hormones, suggesting a direct link between simplicity and the capacity to nurture relationships. Epicurus would likely have welcomed this evidence, seeing it as confirmation that the removal of unnecessary desires expands the space in our hearts for genuine companionship. Let us now turn to a concrete example of how Epicurean principles can be applied in everyday life. Imagine a young professional named Maya, living in a bustling metropolis, juggling a demanding career and a constant stream of digital notifications. She feels a lingering sense of unease, despite a respectable salary and a sleek apartment. Inspired by Epicurean thought, Maya decides to experiment with a friendship and simplicity regimen. She begins by inviting two close friends over for a modest dinner of lentil soup, whole grain bread, and seasonal vegetables, turning off her phone and focusing on conversation. Over the weeks, she notices that these evenings leave her feeling more rested than any night out at a trendy restaurant. Simultaneously, she adopts a dietary moderation. She reduces her coffee intake from 4 cups to 1, replaces sugary snacks with fresh fruit, and finds that her energy levels stabilize. Finally, Maya evaluates her desires, asking herself whether a new gadget truly contributes to tranquility. She chooses to postpone the purchase, redirecting the saved funds toward a weekend retreat with her friends in the countryside, where they hike, share stories, and practice mindful breathing. Over time, Maya reports lower anxiety, better sleep, and a renewed sense of purpose, outcomes that echo the Epicurean promise that friendship, simple living, and community nurture ataraxia. Another vivid illustration comes from a community garden project in a low-income neighborhood of Detroit. The organizers, inspired by both Epicurean and Buddhist values, designed the garden as a place where residents could grow modest portions of vegetables, share meals, and build relationships. They deliberately limited the garden's scale to avoid the temptation of profit-driven expansion, focusing instead on the pleasure of collective labor and the satisfaction of a simple harvest. Participants reported a decrease in feelings of isolation, and a study conducted by the University of Michigan found that those involved in the garden experienced a 20% reduction in reported stress levels after 3 months. The garden's success demonstrates how the ancient principle of simple, shared sustenance can be actualized in modern urban settings, fostering both physical health and social cohesion. Returning to the philosophical lineage, we should also consider how Epicurus's ideas intersect with Aristotle's view of friendship. Aristotle distinguished 3 kinds of friendship, those of utility, pleasure, and virtue. He argued that the highest form, friendship of virtue, is based on mutual admiration of each other's character. Epicurus, while emphasizing pleasure, redefined pleasure not as sensual indulgence but as the absence of pain and the presence of mental serenity. In this sense, his philia aligns with Aristotle's virtuous friendship. Both see the friend as a mirror for moral development. However, Epicurus departs from Aristotle by insisting that even the most modest, non-elite friendships can be sufficient for a tranquil life, whereas Aristotle reserved the highest friendships for the few good men of the polis. This divergence highlights the radical egalitarianism embedded in Epicurean community. Anyone capable of rational reflection can become a true friend, regardless of social rank. The Stoic critique also invites us to examine the interplay between autonomy and relationality. While the Stoics champion self-sufficiency, modern philosophers such as Charles Taylor have argued that our identities are fundamentally socially constituted. Taylor's concept of the social self echoes Epicurus's claim that we are born into a world of relationships and that our well-being is intrinsically linked to the quality of those bonds. In this light, the Stoic insistence on independence may appear incomplete, whereas Epicurus offers a more integrated vision. Autonomy is achieved not through isolation, but through the cultivation of relationships that reinforce rational judgment and emotional stability. Let us also reflect on how Epicurean simplicity informs contemporary environmental ethics. The modern zero-waste movement, which encourages individuals to minimize consumption and waste, can be seen as a practical extension of Epicurus's avoidance of unnecessary desires. By limiting our appetite for material goods, we reduce the ecological footprint, thereby contributing to the well-being of the broader community, human and non-human alike. This ecological dimension adds another layer to Epicurus's ethic. Simplicity is not merely a personal strategy for tranquility, but a communal responsibility that respects the finite resources of the planet. Now imagine a dialogue between a modern minimalist, a Buddhist monk, and a psychologist, each drawing on Epicurean insights. The minimalist says, I keep only what I need so my mind stays uncluttered. The monk replies, in the Sangha, we practice sharing what we have, recognizing that attachment to objects leads to suffering. The psychologist adds, our data show that people with strong social ties and low material desire report higher levels of life satisfaction. As they converse, they each point to a common thread. The convergence of friendship, simplicity, and community as a pathway to well-being, a pathway that Epicurus articulated over 2 millennia ago. To bring these ideas home, let us revisit the core Epicurean maxim. Pleasure is the beginning and the end of the blessed life. Yet the pleasure he envisions is not the fleeting rush of a luxury purchase, but the enduring calm that arises when we live among friends, eat simply, and keep our desires in check. In the garden, this calm was cultivated through daily rituals, a shared meal, a brief pause for gratitude, a discussion of the nature of the gods that emphasized their indifference to human affairs, and a collective commitment to avoid the anxieties that arise from fearing death or the unknown. In the Roman community, the same pattern repeated: modest meals, mutual support, and a shared dedication to living without unnecessary fear. Consider the analogy of a well-tuned instrument. A violin, when properly strung and cared for, produces a clear, resonant tone. If the strings are too tight, the sound becomes strained. If they are too loose, the note wavers. Epicurean simplicity is the careful tuning of our desires, tight enough to sustain life, loose enough to allow freedom. Friendship is the resonant body of the instrument, amplifying the pure tone of the mind. Community is the musician's hand, guiding the bow to produce harmony. When any element is out of balance, excessive desire, isolation, or a chaotic environment, the music falters and the soul experiences disquiet. Let us also hear the voice of Epicurus himself, preserved in his letter to Pythagoras. Do not spoil your mind with the desire for wealth is a great hindrance to the tranquil soul. And his famous assertion, if you wish to be rich, do not add to your possessions, but subtract from your wants. These lines remind us that the path to a serene life is paved not by acquisition, but by subtraction, an idea that reverberates through contemporary minimalist slogans and psychological findings alike. In closing, we might ask, what does the Epicurean ethic of friendship, simplicity, and community offer us today? First, it invites us to reassess the hierarchy of our desires. By distinguishing between what is essential and what merely tempts us, we can allocate our time and energy toward relationships that enrich our lives. Second, it encourages us to view community not as a peripheral luxury, but as a central pillar of moral flourishing. Whether in a small garden, a Roman meeting house, a modern co-living space, or an online forum, the act of sharing simple meals and honest conversation cultivates the ataraxia that Epicurus prized. Third, it provides a framework for integrating ancient wisdom with contemporary science. The reduction of material excess, the nurturing of supportive networks, and the practice of mindful moderation have all been shown to improve mental health, physical longevity, and even environmental sustainability. As you reflect on these teachings, consider the simple choices you can make today. Perhaps you will invite a friend over for a modest dinner, or you will clear a cluttered drawer, or you will join a local group that meets to discuss ideas over tea. In each of these acts, you are echoing the ancient garden, allowing friendship to blossom, simplicity to settle, and community to flourish. And in doing so, you are moving ever closer to the tranquil life that Epicurus, Metrodorus, the Roman Amici Epicuri, and countless seekers across the ages have endeavored to achieve. May the gentle rhythm of this contemplation settle within you, like the soft rustle of olive leaves in the evening wind, reminding us all that the greatest pleasure is found not in the abundance of things, but in the abundance of hearts gathered together in quiet, purposeful living. The story of Epicureanism is a story of ideas that have traveled across centuries, slipping through the cracks of orthodoxy, resurfacing in unexpected places, and being reshaped by each new generation that encounters it. To understand the legacy of Epicurus, we must first listen to the echo of his own voice, recorded in the fragments that survived his garden, and then follow that echo as it reverberates through the corridors of early Christianity, the dimly lit libraries of the medieval world, the salons of the Enlightenment, and finally into the bustling cafes and digital platforms of our own time. Epicurus began his school, the Garden, in 306 BC on the outskirts of Athens, a modest plot of land where men and women could gather without the constraints of the polis. He taught that the highest good is ataraxia, peace of mind, accompanied by aponia, the absence of bodily pain. In his own words, pleasure is the beginning and the end of a happy life. Yet he qualified pleasure not as indulgence in excess, but as the natural, moderate enjoyment of simple things. Friendship, a modest meal, the contemplation of the stars. He warned against the fear of gods and death, insisting that the gods, if they exist, are indifferent to human affairs, and that death is simply the cessation of sensation, nothing to us. This radical redefinition of the good life set the stage for a philosophical tradition that would be both celebrated and reviled. The first major clash came not from philosophers but from the early Christian community, which saw in Epicureanism a dangerous rival to its own claims about the afterlife and divine providence. In the 2nd century, the Church Father Clement of Alexandria wrote, "The Epicureans deny the immortality of the soul, and therefore they deny the hope of the resurrection." The accusation was simple. If pleasure is the ultimate aim and the gods are indifferent, then moral responsibility collapses. This line of criticism hardened into a broader condemnation that would echo through the ages. The most striking modern manifestation of this ancient dispute arrived in 1991, when the Vatican issued a document titled Letter to the People of God, addressed to the faithful worldwide. In that letter, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith described Epicureanism as a pagan philosophy that reduces the human person to the pursuit of sensual gratification, thereby undermining the Christian vision of a transcendent purpose. The document went further, warning that the popular appropriation of Epicurean as a synonym for hedonistic excess was not merely a linguistic slip, but a theological error that could lead believers away from the hope offered by the gospel. The Vatican's warning was not the first time the Church had cast Epicureanism into the shadows. Even before the formal condemnation, the early Christian writer Augustine in his City of God dismissed the Epicurean garden as a place where the soul is left to its own appetites, without the guiding hand of divine grace. Augustine's critique was rooted in his own philosophical journey, moving from Manichaeism to Neoplatonism, and his desire to replace the Epicurean emphasis on bodily tranquility with a Christian focus on the soul's eternal destiny. In the medieval period, the dominant philosophical framework was scholasticism, a synthesis of Aristotelian logic and Christian theology. Epicurean texts, already scarce, were largely ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to the questions of metaphysics and theology that preoccupied scholars such as Thomas Aquinas. The very idea of a garden where philosophers gathered to discuss the nature of pleasure seemed out of step with the monastic cloisters where the great debates of the age were held. Yet the seeds Epicurus planted were not entirely buried. In the 13th century, the Arabic philosopher Al-Farabi, writing in a context that was more open to Greek thought, referenced the Epicurean view of the universe as composed of atoms moving through the void. Though Al-Farabi was a Neoplatonist, his engagement with Epicurean physics demonstrates that the doctrine survived, albeit in fragmented form, within the intellectual exchanges between the Islamic world and the Latin West. This transmission set the stage for the Renaissance rediscovery of the original texts, when scholars such as Marsilio Ficino and later, the French Enlightenment thinkers began to sift through the dusty manuscripts that had survived the fall of the Roman Empire. The Enlightenment marked a dramatic revival of Epicurean ideas, not in the form of a direct philosophical school, but as a symbolic rallying point against the dogmas of both church and state. Voltaire, the great French satirist, famously declared, "I have never been a fan of the church, but I have always been a fan of Epicurus." In his Philosophical Dictionary, Voltaire praised Epicurus for his criticism of superstition and his emphasis on natural pleasure. He saw in Epicurus a kindred spirit who dared to question the authority of the divine and to champion the simple, natural life. Voltaire's admiration was not merely literary. He used Epicurean arguments to support the cause of religious tolerance, arguing that fear of divine punishment was an artificial restraint on human happiness. Across the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson, the architect of American liberty, found in Epicureanism a philosophical foundation for his own ideas about government and individual rights. In a letter to John Adams in 1813, Jefferson wrote, "The doctrines of Epicurus, that the world is composed of atoms, that the gods are indifferent, that the goal of life is to seek peace and avoid pain, these are the very foundations of a free and rational society." Jefferson's reference to the peace of mind that Epicurus prized resonated with his own belief that a government should be designed to protect the natural rights of its citizens, allowing them the space to pursue happiness without fear of tyranny. Jefferson's appropriation of Epicurean thought illustrates how the ancient philosopher's ideas could be reinterpreted to serve a modern political project: the defense of liberty against the oppressive structures of both monarchy and ecclesiastical authority. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw a further transformation of Epicureanism as it entered the realm of existentialist and secular humanist discourse. The existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, were fascinated by the notion that the universe is indifferent and that meaning must be created by individuals. Though Sartre never cited Epicurus directly, his insistence that existence precedes essence echoes the Epicurean dismissal of divine teleology. In the same vein, the secular humanist movement, which rose to prominence after the two world wars, embraced Epicurean ideas as part of a broader commitment to human flourishing based on reason, empathy, and the pursuit of well-being. Humanist Manifesto II, published in 1973, declares that human beings are capable of creating a just and humane society without recourse to supernatural authority, a sentiment that aligns closely with Epicurus's claim that the gods do not intervene in human affairs. In the latter half of the 20th century, a new wave of reinterpretation emerged, one that sought to blend the ancient wisdom of the garden with contemporary scientific insights into happiness. Positive psychology, a field pioneered by Martin Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, introduced concepts such as flow, subjective well-being, and eudaimonia, which, though rooted in modern empirical research, echo Epicurean concerns about the conditions that lead to a tranquil mind. Seligman, in his 2002 book Authentic Happiness, cites the ancient philosophers, including Epicurus, as early proponents of the idea that happiness is not a fleeting emotion, but a stable state cultivated through virtuous activity. The parallel is striking. Epicurus taught that the greatest pleasures arise from the cultivation of friendships and the practice of moderation, while positive psychologists argue that lasting well-being stems from meaningful relationships and the alignment of one's actions with personal values. It is in this contemporary context that we encounter the second anecdote, a vivid illustration of how Epicurean ideas have been repurposed for modern life. In 2015, a group of young professionals in New York City, disillusioned with the relentless hustle culture, founded what they called Epicurean clubs. These gatherings, held in lofts, community gardens, and even virtual spaces, were designed to explore the art of savoring simple pleasures. A shared tea ceremony, a walk through a botanical garden, a quiet evening of reading poetry. The clubs emphasized digital detox, encouraging members to turn off smartphones for a set period each day, to practice mindful eating, and to cultivate friendships that extended beyond superficial networking. One founder in a blog post wrote, "We are not chasing hedonism. We are returning to the garden of Epicurus, where the aim is to remove the anxieties that keep us from enjoying the present." The clubs quickly spread to other urban centers, Berlin, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, each adapting the core idea of seeking tranquility through modest, intentional living. This movement demonstrates how Epicurus's ancient counsel can be reimagined as a response to the pressures of contemporary digital life. Yet, as with any revival, there are critics who argue that the modern Epicurean self-help movement distorts the original doctrine. The first counterargument contends that the popular appropriation of Epicureanism reduces a sophisticated ethical system to a simplistic mantra of relax and enjoy. Critics point out that Epicurus placed a great deal of emphasis on the cultivation of virtue, justice, prudence, courage, and temperance as essential components of a pleasurable life. In the letter to Menocius, he writes, "It is not the pleasure of the body, but the pleasure of the soul that is the highest good." The modern self-help narrative, they argue, often neglects this moral dimension, focusing instead on sensory indulgence, gourmet food, spa treatments, or the latest wellness gadget, without the accompanying commitment to ethical conduct. Moreover, the original Epicurean community was bound by a shared commitment to mutual aid. The garden was a place where resources were pooled, and members supported each other in the pursuit of ataraxia. In contrast, contemporary Epicurean circles can sometimes become exclusive clubs that prioritize personal comfort over communal responsibility. The second counterargument, more politically charged, asserts that an emphasis on pleasure, even a moderated one, can undermine social justice concerns. Critics argue that by focusing on the individual's tranquility, Epicureanism may inadvertently encourage a retreat from the world's suffering, a kind of ethical solipsism. In a 2019 article in the Journal of Political Philosophy, scholar Maria Fernandez writes, "If the highest aim is personal peace, the moral imperative to confront systemic injustice is weakened, because the pursuit of pleasure can become an excuse for disengagement." This critique resonates with contemporary debates about self-care versus collective action, especially in movements such as Black Lives Matter or climate justice, where the call to personal well-being is sometimes seen as competing with the urgency of collective struggle. To evaluate these criticisms, it helps to compare Epicureanism with other ethical theories that have grappled with similar tensions. Utilitarianism, for instance, also grounds morality in the maximization of pleasure, or more precisely, happiness, and the minimization of pain. Jeremy Bentham famously defined the principle of utility as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. While this appears to align with Epicurean concerns, utilitarianism diverges in its consequentialist calculus. The moral worth of an action is judged solely by its outcomes, regardless of the actor's intentions or virtues. Epicurus, by contrast, emphasized the role of prudence and the cultivation of a virtuous character as prerequisites for genuine pleasure. He warned against the short-term pleasures that lead to long-term pain, a caution that utilitarianism sometimes overlooks in its focus on aggregate outcomes. Positive psychology, meanwhile, offers a middle ground. It acknowledges the importance of both hedonic enjoyment and eudaimonic fulfillment, encouraging individuals to seek pleasure while also engaging in purposeful, value-driven activities. In this sense, contemporary positive psychology can be seen as a modern embodiment of Epicurus's balanced approach, integrating the pursuit of pleasure with the cultivation of meaning. The practical applications of Epicurean thought in today's world are manifold, especially when we consider the pervasive stressors of modern life, the constant ping of notifications, the pressure to achieve, the fear of missing out. One concrete area where Epicurean principles can be applied is stress reduction. Epicurus taught that anxiety about the future and fear of divine wrath are the primary sources of mental disturbance. By removing these irrational fears, through rational reflection on the nature of death and the indifference of the cosmos, one can achieve ataraxia. Modern mindfulness practices echo this approach. By focusing attention on the present moment and observing thoughts without judgment, individuals can diminish the grip of anxiety. A study published in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine in 2020 found that participants who practiced daily mindfulness meditation reported a 30% reduction in perceived stress, a result that aligns closely with the Epicurean prescription of removing the unnecessary fears that disturb the soul. Decision-making is another domain where Epicurean wisdom offers guidance. Epicurus emphasized the importance of prudence, choosing actions that lead to long-term tranquility rather than short-term gratification. In contemporary behavioral economics, the concept of delay discounting describes how people tend to devalue future rewards in favor of immediate ones. By training oneself to recognize the hidden costs of impulsive choices, such as the health consequences of overeating or the financial strain of unnecessary purchases, one can adopt a more Epicurean decision-making style that privileges sustainable well-being. An experiment conducted at Stanford University in 2018 demonstrated that participants who were prompted to consider the future self before making consumption choices were 25% more likely to select healthier options, illustrating how a simple shift in perspective can align behavior with the Epicurean ideal of lasting pleasure. Digital detox, perhaps the most visible manifestation of Epicurean practice in the 21st century, directly addresses the modern addiction to technology. Epicurus warned against the endless desire for more, a sentiment that resonates with today's always-on culture. The 2015 Epicurean clubs mentioned earlier incorporated scheduled periods of device-free time, encouraging members to engage in tactile sensory experiences, reading a physical book, cooking a meal, or simply sitting in silence. Research from the University of Copenhagen in 2021 found that participants who limited their screen time to 2 hours per day reported higher levels of life satisfaction and lower levels of depressive symptoms. This empirical evidence supports the Epicurean claim that reducing unnecessary stimulation can lead to a calmer, more contented mind. To illustrate these applications, consider the story of Maya, a 32-year-old graphic designer living in Los Angeles. Maya found herself caught in a cycle of late-night scrolling, caffeine-fueled work sessions, and an ever-growing to-do list. She felt constantly fatigued and anxious, despite her outward success. After reading a modern interpretation of Epicurus's Letter to Menocius in a popular wellness blog, Maya decided to adopt a simple Epicurean experiment. She set aside an hour each evening for quiet contemplation, turning off all electronic devices, lighting a candle, and sipping herbal tea while reflecting on the day's events without judgment. She also began to limit her consumption of news, recognizing that the fear of world events amplified her anxiety. Over 3 months, Maya reported a marked reduction in her stress levels, an increased appreciation for the taste of her meals, and a deeper sense of satisfaction from spending time with close friends rather than scrolling through social media. Her experience embodies the core Epicurean insight that the removal of unnecessary desires and the cultivation of modest, meaningful pleasures can transform one's inner landscape. Another example comes from a community health initiative in rural Portugal, where a group of elderly residents formed a garden circle inspired by Epicurean philosophy. They met weekly in a local park to share simple meals, discuss poetry, and practice gentle exercises. The program, evaluated by the University of Lisbon, showed that participants experienced a significant improvement in mental health metrics, including reduced symptoms of depression and increased feelings of social connectedness. The organizers explicitly referenced Epicurus's emphasis on friendship as the greatest of all pleasures, demonstrating how an ancient principle can be operationalized to address contemporary public health challenges. These stories, together with the historical anecdotes, illustrate the enduring relevance of Epicurean thought. Yet the conversation remains incomplete without acknowledging the broader philosophical landscape in which Epicureanism sits. The Stoics, for instance, offered a contrasting approach. Instead of seeking pleasure as the highest good, they pursued virtue and the acceptance of fate. While the Stoic sage aims for apatheia, a freedom from passion, Epicurus seeks ataraxia, a freedom from disturbance, but through the careful selection of pleasurable experiences. Modern philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum have drawn on both traditions, arguing that a flourishing life requires a balance of emotional richness, echoing Epicurean pleasure, and moral commitment, echoing Stoic virtue. In this synthesis, we see a pathway that addresses the earlier criticism that Epicureanism neglects social justice. By integrating the pursuit of personal tranquility with a responsibility to the common good, we can imagine a communal Epicureanism that honors both the individual's right to peace and the community's need for justice. The dialogue between Epicureanism and contemporary ethical theories also extends to environmental ethics. The modern deep ecology movement, championed by philosophers like Arne Naess, emphasizes the intrinsic value of nature and the necessity of living in harmony with the natural world. Epicurus, who taught that the universe is composed of atoms moving in the void, held a materialist view that can be interpreted as a respect for the natural order. Moreover, his advocacy for simple living, eschewing excess and focusing on what truly satisfies, aligns with sustainable consumption patterns. By adopting an Epicurean lifestyle that prioritizes modest pleasures and reduces unnecessary material demands, individuals can contribute to environmental preservation, thereby linking personal well-being with planetary health. Returning to the Vatican's 1991 letter to the people of God, we see a paradoxical moment in the modern reception of Epicureanism. While the document condemns Epicurean paganism as a threat to Christian doctrine, it inadvertently acknowledges the potency of Epicurus's ideas in shaping contemporary moral discourse. The Vatican's concern reflects a broader tension, the challenge of reconciling ancient philosophical systems with evolving cultural values. In the same way that early Christians once viewed Epicureanism as a rival, today's secular societies must grapple with how to integrate a philosophy that celebrates pleasure without slipping into moral relativism. The revival of Epicurean clubs in 2015 provides a counterpoint to this tension, showcasing a grassroots movement that reinterprets the ancient garden as a space for communal well-being rather than a private indulgence. These clubs often emphasize inclusivity, inviting people from diverse backgrounds to share in the simple joys of conversation, food, and nature. In doing so, they echo the original garden's ethos of friendship and mutual support, while simultaneously adapting to the needs of a digital age that is saturated with information overload. The clubs also serve as informal laboratories for testing the practical applications of Epicurean principles. Participants report lower stress levels, improved sleep, and a heightened sense of purpose, outcomes that modern psychology attributes to social connection and mindful practice. Yet the question remains, can the ancient doctrine of Epicurus truly survive the transformations it has undergone? The answer, perhaps, lies in recognizing that philosophy is not a static monument but a living conversation. Epicurus himself said, "The wise man does not consider the past as a burden, nor the future as a threat." In the same spirit, we can view the legacy of Epicureanism as a series of dialogues across time, each generation picking up the thread, weaving in its own concerns, and passing it forward. The early Christian condemnations, the medieval neglect, the Enlightenment's intellectual reclamation, the 20th century existential reinterpretations, and the 21st century wellness movements are all chapters in a larger narrative that reflects humanity's enduring quest for a life worth living. When we consider the modern applications of Epicurean thought, stress reduction, prudent decision-making, digital detox, we are, in effect, enacting the very practice Epicurus advocated. The careful cultivation of a tranquil mind through rational reflection and the enjoyment of modest, lasting pleasures. The critiques that label contemporary Epicurean self-help as a distortion remind us to stay faithful to the original emphasis on virtue and friendship. The concerns that pleasure may undermine social justice compel us to expand the garden, inviting collective responsibility alongside personal serenity. By weaving together these strands, we can construct a version of Epicureanism that honors its historical roots while speaking powerfully to the challenges of our age. In closing, let us recall one of Epicurus's most famous sayings, preserved in the fragmentary Principal Doctrines. It is impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and justly, and it is impossible to live wisely and justly without living pleasantly. This ancient paradox invites us to see pleasure, wisdom, and justice not as competing goals, but as interdependent facets of a flourishing existence. As we navigate the complexities of modern life, balancing the demands of work, the lure of technology, the call for social responsibility, perhaps the Garden of Epicurus offers a timeless blueprint. Cultivate friendships, temper desires, confront irrational fears, and find joy in the simple, natural moments that surround us. In doing so, we may discover that the path to ataraxia is not a retreat from the world, but a mindful engagement with it, guided by the gentle, steady light of reason and the quiet, enduring pleasure of a well-lived life.